I'd like to say good evening to all of you this evening. I hope you're enjoying the sunny weather. But tonight, I'd like to very much welcome Brian Donovan of Find My Path to our Tuesday Talk series. Brian's career has been at the forefront of digital heritage for more than 20 years, since moving from lecturing in history at Trinity College to the founding of Clan in 1998, to now working as the Strategic Initiatives Manager at Find My Past. Brian has been responsible for directly overseeing the digitization and indexation of millions of Irish historic records from numerous libraries and archives around Ireland and abroad. And he was the technical advisor for the landmark Trinity College project to digitise the 1641 depositions, the medieval chancery records, as well as other cultural and educational initiatives. In 2010, he established a joint venture partnership with DC Thomson to create Find My Past Ireland, where he continues to help develop their Irish collections and is currently responsible for a range of global initiatives involving new data, new markets, and new opportunities. Brian's publications include The Clan of O'Donovan, 1534 to 1700 an introduction, and John Donovan, United Irishmen and the Wexford Donovans in 1798. You are very welcome, Brian, and I'll hand over to you now.
Very good.
Thank you, Paula. That's much appreciated. I'll just try and get my screen share to work now, so bear with me. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
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 Brilliant. Now let's see if I can remember what my notes are and what I'm talking about. Today I want to talk about the 1921 census of England and Wales. This may not seem like the most obvious thing to be talking about when you're in an Irish context, but you'll understand why now in a short while. Paul has already described who I am, so I probably don't need to do this anymore. I have a wonderfully prosaic title at Find My Path, Strategic Initiatives Manager, but it actually involves basically me spending time dealing with other businesses, partnerships, archives, libraries, and trying to develop what we do. And my background is academic history, and as Paula said, I set up Clan in the Irish Family History Centre at Epic, which is doing great guns at the moment, which is great to see. Anyway, what I want to talk about today is the 1921 census of England and Wales. And this is broadly speaking the structure of what I'm going to talk about. I may stick to it and I may not, you never know. I'm not, we'll just see how things go. And what I will say is that despite what was said by Paula, I don't mind being interrupted. And as I said to everybody before, I have 3 teenage children. So being interrupted is the nature of existence for me. So please interrupt me if you don't understand what I'm talking about, because if you don't understand, there's probably others there who don't understand. So please just pipe up and ask. If it's something specific about a piece of research that's about you're doing, wait till the end, because it's more not general. Anyway, let's start looking at what Britain was like in the 1920s. Britain in 1921 was so unlike today. It was a world coming out of a global pandemic. It was beset by protests, civil and industrial strife. There was a massive distrust in politicians, never been like it before. Members of the government were accused of corruption and taking backhanders, and parts of the UK were on the brink of independence. So different from today. Joking aside, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of the census returns to give you a flavour of what life in England and Wales is like then. You'll see this return here. You'll see all the stains across it. What are those stains? Well, let's zoom in and have a look. The stains, they state in a piece of text here, written on it, a slight accident with crude carbolic in course of necessary disinfection of all transmissions and exchanges in this prehistoric village. This was the centre, and this was the period of the Spanish flu. So that very much impacted people's thoughts. There were many other things that impacted people's thoughts, but the big thing that was different about them than now, because all those other things I talked about, of course, are very familiar to us, is that they had just come out of a war that had left 1 million people dead. Over 2 more million people came back home with a disability. There was 192,000 war widows and nearly 360,000 children who'd lost fathers. This was a wound right across society, and the general impact on the population is recorded within the census. And there's the sense of palpable anger and frustration is recorded all over the place. I'll give you a few examples. Here's one with this wonderful cartoon on a return. Let's zoom in and look at it. This is hauntingly prescient, really, to be honest with you, because they have a cartoon of 3 obviously sort of like head honcho business types sitting around a table. And the caption on the side is that they're counting cannon fodder for the next war in 1936, with a lady bringing them tea. Of course, the war was not in 1936, it was 3 years later, but there was some truth, but you can give you an idea of it. More to the point, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of the day, had committed the country to building a land fit for heroes, which was a wonderful slogan. You know, politicians come out with these wonderful slogans, which mean absolutely sweet FA. Anyway, you actually see this commentary on the census returns about the land fit for heroes. Lord George, I hereby request you to bring forth the land fit for heroes. Do the nation's duty to provide houses. The houses issue is massively important then. If you actually look at the returns, there's the number of people who were 2 families to a house was about nearly 20%. The number of people who are 3 families or more to the house was 6%. Very high proportion of the population. The amount of people out of work was huge too. You'll get this return, out of work, now living in the land fit for heroes. The anger is palpable, as I said. 5 persons living in one room. Stop talking about your homes for heroes and start building them. Also, people were angry about the amount of money being spent on the war. Here we have 500 billion, trillion, whatever it is, and we will not forget it. I mean, people were so angry about what had happened in the war. We tend to forget that, you know. Also, there were other points of anger which would be very much of their time. Here's an example. It is disgusting that the unemployed ex-soldiers should be deprived of government work by appointing women enumerators to this census. As you may understand it, there was 38,000 enumerators, of which many were women. And of course, the women themselves, 750,000 women were made redundant at the end of the war because they've been brought into the workforce to actually fulfill industrial jobs. And as soon as the war was over, they were kicked out unceremoniously again. But yeah, some people were unhappy with that. Divorce, another big issue in the census. It's the first time ever they had actually tracked divorce in the census. And some people, you know, probably we will be reminded about some of the comments and slogans being used if you remember the divorce referendums in the 80s. I mean, I strongly object to the question of divorce being raised in this paper. I believe that divorce is a curse to the country, and so on. You can see that other commentary there. Anyway, this palpable anger, particularly amongst ordinary people, had led to a massive rise in union membership and union organization. There was such a huge number of people who were out of work. Strikes were happening across the country. And in fact, this is really important for the 1921 census because it was originally supposed to have happened on the 24th of April. But they had to cancel it because they were fearing a general strike. So instead, they decided to put it off until June. And this is important for us in our research. Why? Because generally speaking, censuses are taken in March, April, because the people who are experts in enumeration back then are no different from today. And they argue that, in fact, people are most likely to be at home in March and April. So June is not a good time because, of course, it's the beginning of the summer, not the full summer. The schools aren't closed yet, but still, it's summer enough. So it's a holiday census, which is very different from previous British censuses or English censuses, or Irish ones for that matter. So you see inflated populations in seaside towns like Brighton and Torquay. It sort of reminds us really of a salient lesson about census records. A census is a frozen point of time rather than recording what usually happened. Holding a summer census led to these seaside towns having a massive increase in population compared to the rest of the country. So your ancestors may not be at home on census day, but in a hotel or guest house. Or if they're wealthy, they might have even left England altogether and gone overseas. So a census, and this is true of all censuses, they ask where you are, not where you live, and who you're with, not who's in your family. That's worthwhile remembering in any census research. Okay, so what's not included in the 1921 census of England and Wales? No surprise, the population of Ireland and the population of Scotland are not included. But what's interesting about it is the British services, the British Army, and anybody involved in the armed services is included except those for Scotland. So anybody who's in services in Ireland is included. Also, merchant navy and fishing vessels, which were not in port at census night and which did not return to port in the days immediately after the census. Now, I know that's rather niche. I mean, very few of you might be looking for that, but it's worth knowing that not all navy and fishing vessels are recorded. So what about the 1921 census for Ireland? I hear you asking. I mean, you know, none of us have actually been wondered about this at all, have we? I mean, I think we all know we were having a spot of trouble in 1921. I'm not going to go into it too much. This is a wonderful set of photographs which were taken as part of the American report on the state of Ireland in 1921. We came across to find out what the hell was going on. The British Labour Party did a book very similar to this, and the photographs that you actually see within it are really quite illuminating. Here's another example of these. Of course, it wasn't until later in 1921, December, that the British Army pulled out. And so the situation started to calm down. Of course, and the Civil War erupted thereafter. So, of course, the whole thing went doolally again for a couple of years. But the 1921 census of Ireland was supposed to happen. And many thanks I have to Audrey Collins. Many of you will know who she is from the National Archives. She dug out the original return forms that were going to be used in Ireland. So they had done everything to have the census in Ireland. They printed the returns, had everything ready to go. And then, of course, they had to pull the whole plan at the last minute. So instead, the 1921 census was actually carried out in 1926. And you all know about that. And of course, as I tell everybody, when that's going to be released is the true Irish mystery. I'm not terribly sure. I mean, we keep on hearing that it's going to come out, but there is absolutely no clear directive of what's going to happen yet. It's not a very big job, I will add. The 1921 census of England and Wales was 38 million households. The 1926 census for the entire country is tiny for Ireland, so it could be done very quickly. So when I'm talking about the Irish in the 1921 census of England and Wales, what am I talking about? Let's go and have a look at a map. And this, I'm hoping, I've given this presentation a couple of times to Australian and American hobbyists and family historians and genealogists, and they find this very confusing. So I'm kind of hoping you guys won't. But if you do, please pipe up. There's 364,000. Nearly 1% of the entire population of England and Wales was born in Ireland, born north and south. You've got to remember, in 1921, we had two new political formations in Ireland. Under the 1920 Government of Ireland Act, which was passed in Westminster, we had the erection of the state of Northern Ireland, which was a province, and a state attached to the UK, which of course continued on right to the present day. And we had not the Free State yet. It was Home Rule Parliament in Dublin, and the state was called Southern Ireland. Now, Southern Ireland never came into existence as an actual practical entity. It was only ever called Southern Ireland in the 1920 Act, and of course it was replaced under the treaty by Siarstad Éireann, the Irish Free State. But of the people of those two areas, which are the same areas as we understand today, we had 18% of the Irish came from what is now Northern Ireland, and 77% came from what is now the Republic. And that's a little bit more skewed towards the south than the north if we look at the actual population in the 1926 census. Because you only had 4.2 million people in the 1926 census, north and south. The country was really empty at that point by comparison with today, certainly nowhere near what it had been before. So we had more people from what is now the Republic. And what do these people look like? These are Irish born, because we're not dealing with first or second generation Irish. This is purely those who were born in Ireland. Let's go and look at some statistics. I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you, but always remember that generalizations will always hide the specifics of your family history or any family history. And genealogists, as genealogists, we all delve into the micro-history, the specifics that rarely conform to generalizations that social historians like. I think we all know that. So let's just deal with those generalizations first. And you can do with what you will with them, because some of them are actually genuinely interesting. First of all, how about we look at the age profile, which is kind of interesting. It's very similar right across every single point at the population, and it will give you the impression that migratory patterns must have stayed consistent, and that's not the case, and we'll find out very soon why that's not the case. The split between men and women is roughly equal, as you'd expect. There's a very high proportion of widows, I should say. They're overwhelmingly, I say widows because I mean there are widowers, but I mean it's overwhelmingly women who are widowed. It's 7 to 3. I don't think it's much different from the general population. Women did live longer than men then. It's much more pronounced at that period than it is now. But the migratory thing is kind of interesting. So let's have a look at this migration. Now, I've looked at the census stats from 1851 right up to 1921. And what you'll notice immediately is that 1921 is a low point of migration. The number of people born in Ireland in 1921 is the lowest it's ever been at that point. And I think that would give you a full sense, because 1921 is, yes, a low point, but it was just about to start to increase dramatically thereafter. And certainly it keeps on rising right up to the 1950s, possibly even to the early 1960s. It's difficult to be clear about that. So it's an unusually low point. And why is that? Well, in the late 19th century, affordable travel, particularly through steamships, became available to America, and prospects were much better in America. So for those who wanted to migrate for economic reasons, which was the bulk of the Irish population who were migrating, America offered many, many opportunities which Britain simply didn't. So it was much more attractive to go there. Now, where did they come from, this group? I should have said that after 1921, the situation reversed and it became much more difficult to get into America because the rules changed. And of course, the opportunity suddenly looked weighed up better in England and Wales, so people started to travel there more for work. So where did they come from? Well, it's no great surprise. They came from where most people lived. The bulk came from Dublin, from Cork, from Down, from Mayo, Antrim, Tipperary, Galway, Limerick, Waterford, Wexford. It's really where the bulk of the population was anyway. So there's nothing particularly unusual or particular area that people came from more than others in 1921. But it's more interesting where they were going to. So let's go through the counties. The county with the highest number of Irish born was Lancashire. Again, I don't think anybody here is going to be too surprised. London and Middlesex have put together is possibly even more. So yeah, London in the broader area and Lancashire are the two big draws. We also have a significant number settled in the Yorkshire West Riding, Leeds, basically. Surrey, Kent, Cheshire, Hampshire, Glamorgan, Durham. These are areas where there's high employment prospects. And they're different for different parts. Lancashire and some of these other areas, and we'll look up more closely why they went there, but they're would have appealed more to the men who are migrating because they have heavy industry, they have coal mining, they have iron, steelworks, shipbuilding. Whereas London and Middlesex and some of the home counties offered a great prospect for women traveling because of service and the opportunities of getting work in service. So let's look at the counties. Because this other big table we have here tells you the number of men and women who are recorded per 10,000 in the population. And you'll see the percentage which are Irish born on the right-hand side. And again, Lancashire is the highest with more than 2% of the population Irish born. And so on down. If you look at it, I mean, London, as I said, is more women, like Surrey and East Sussex, because they're mostly getting jobs in service. Dorset is more men because, again, there's industry there. Yorkshire North Riding, Leeds is with its coal mining, there's and so on. Glamorgan and Northumberland, again, coal and steel tends to go hand in hand, and so on. So the towns with the highest concentration of Irish are well, a lot of them just group around up in Merseyside, really. You've got Bootle, Liverpool, Birkenhead, Wallesley, St Helens are all in Merseyside, and they're right up there at the top, with very large percentages of Irish born. And this is coal, shipbuilding, and shipping country, and steel country too. I mean, you got to remember, Liverpool was still the New York of Britain. It was where, it was the great miracle, the industrial miracle, and the shipping heartland of Britain was there. Salford and Manchester were the heart of the textile industry. So again, no surprise there's such a high percentage there. Big draw for people to work there. Plymouth and Devon was the home of the Royal Navy, shipbuilding and shipping in general, but the Navy being, the Royal Navy being the big draw into that place. And some of these other locations like Merthyr and Tydfil, and if I'm Welsh, I really apologise for the pronunciation, Middlesbrough, where they're coal country and steel country too, and later iron. So this is no surprise that it's bringing in so many people. And of course, bear in mind, none of this includes first and second generation Irish, it's purely people born in Ireland. So let's have a look at some of the examples of the Irish born. And I'm going to start with the most famous Irishman living in England and Wales in 1921, who is George Bernard Shaw. He was considered the most important dramatist and cultural influence since Shakespeare. Well, he considered himself that. I think some other people did too. I don't know about it, but he was certainly a very talented polemicist, an astute observer of human behavior, a contrarian, and something of a raconteur as well. He was also Irish. He was born in Dublin, as was, well, his wife, Charlotte Frances Shaw, who's also reported here. She was born in Cork. So let's look at their return in more detail, and we can get a sense of what the layout of these returns look like in the process. This first half of the return is familiar to most of us who've looked at census records. You get the names, you get the relationship to the head of household, you get their ages in years and months now for the first time. You've got months, so you can get a much more precise date of birth if you're working on that. You get their gender, you get their marital status, and that marital status also required children to record whether their father or their mother or both parents was dead. So it's important to check that too. Now, the really valuable thing from, I think, our perspective is the birthplace and nationality thing. This is much, much more detailed than ever before. The census asked you two questions, and it depended whether you were born in England and Wales or whether you were born outside. If you were born in England and Wales, you had to put in the county you were born in and the actual place within that county you were born in. If you were born outside England and Wales, you had to put in the country and then the county, the equivalent of the county. So, for example, we see that George Bernard Shaw has filled his in correctly. He's put in country Ireland and the place Dublin, whereas his wife hasn't. Wonderfully useful for us. She's born in County Cork and she's put in Boscarbury. So she's put in, followed the English pattern of county and place. And a lot of Irish do this. They don't make this distinction of it being following a different rule. So they put in county and place, which is good for us. I should also draw your attention here. You'll notice that beside both of their names is the green notation 15X. The enumerators, after they got these returns, codified everything. And 15X basically means they were born in what is now the Republic of Ireland. And 14X was Northern Ireland. And we'll see that later on. Now, the right-hand side of the form is also different in subtle ways. We get the occupation, which we've had usually before, again with those green notations. These are codified, everything's codified, as I said. You also get who you're working for. This is new. Who is your employer? So in case of George Bernard Shaw, of course, he's self-employed, so he's on own account. You'll notice that his wife, the registrar, was very keen that women just didn't simply write down none. He believed that actually housework was a real work and it deserved to be recognized as such. So they were required to put in home duties. And then, of course, you'll notice everybody else in the house are all servants working for the couple, and of course they're working directly for George Bernard Shaw. Again, the codes are important. There's also on the bottom left-hand corner, there's this little box which is quite important. And if we zoom in, as you see on the right-hand side, this was to determine the number of rooms in the house. So we know there's 2 men, 4 women, 6 persons altogether in this house, and they have 10 rooms. The rooms don't include toilets. Of course, most people would have had outdoor toilets back then, and they don't include kitchens. So they include purely bedrooms, living rooms, places like that. So he's fairly well-to-do, 10 rooms. Let's have a look at another Irish person who is pretty famous back then too, and will be well known to you, is William Butler Yeats. And he's 56, and he's staying at a cottage in Shillingford in Berkshire with his wife George, who's 28 years old. And their young daughter Anne, who's 2 years and 4 months. Again, you'll notice the same thing. 15X is the code for where they come from. They've given a little bit less detail about their birthplace. Now we go into another return here. This is Margaret Kelly. How many of you know who Margaret Kelly is? Just curious to see how many hands up I get. Oh, I can't see any hands up. Well, she was equally famous, but not quite yet. And none of you will immediately recognize her. She was internationally acclaimed in France, Britain, and the USA. She's Rita Kelly. She's a 9-year-old. She's an adopted daughter of Mary Murphy, and both are born in Dublin, and both are living in Liverpool in 48 Daysbrook Lane. They have 3 rooms. The little box down in the corner says they'll be 3 rooms. Anyway, Rita's adopted mother was working as a domestic service for the hospital, and they were obviously very poor. Rita was in such poor health that she was advised to dance by her doctor. Now, the census doesn't tell us that, but I know that. She had striking blue eyes, so her adopted mother called her Bluebell. and she was Miss Bluebell. She joined a Scottish troupe in 1924 and then went to Paris, becoming a dancer and choreographer for the famous Folie Bergeret, where she founded the Bluebell Girls. Then she married the pianist there, who was a Romanian Jew. So when the Germans invaded in World War II, she immediately got involved with the resistance, was imprisoned, but then got out when she worked tirelessly to aid the city's Jews and their fellow resistance fighters. And she was honoured after the war with an OBE from Britain and with a Chevalier de the Legion of Honour from the French. Anyway, these are all very famous, somewhat well-known people, and it's useful to see it. It gives you an entree into it, but that's not the lived reality of most of the Irish you'll find in the 1921 census. So let's have a look and see what that lived reality looks like. Let's start with a very large group, the agricultural labourers. I'd say most Irish who are travelling across to England and Wales didn't really have this in their mind's eye as the way they were going to spend their lives, but there's a bulk of the Irish there who are working in physical labour in farms. There'd always been a steady stream of Irishmen looking for work. From farm work was one of the biggest options, and was here. I'll give you an example of a particularly unusual, but it's not that unusual return, and I think it's a good example of how of again the experience for migratory farm labourers. This return here is from New Cottage Field in Northfleet in Kent, and everybody on this list here is vagrant. You look at the little box about the number of rooms, there are no rooms. They're living in the fields, and they include people from all over England and Ireland, including Elizabeth Bush. She's age 40. You can see her return now at the bottom right-hand corner. She's from Clonmel in Ireland. So it was the existence of farm labourers is pretty precarious, to say the least. Naturally, it wasn't a first choice by those who are travelling across. The next big group I want to look at were domestic servants. Now, I mentioned this before in relation particularly to female migration, because, of course, this was a great opportunity for most young women who wanted to get out of Ireland. There was so much potential for work, particularly in the home counties around London. And so it was a common employment route for young women. So let's go and have a look at an example. This is actually not one from the home counties. This is from Wales. This is a return from St. Mary's Retreat on Union Street in Carmarthen, in Carmarthenshire in Wales. And it's a household of Catholic priests. And they have two servants, both of whom are from Ireland. One is from the north and one's from the south. You can see their place of birth and the employment codes beside them. You see the place of birth is 14X and 15X. You've got Michael Maher and you've got Francis Hammond, who are both the servants there. And you can see the other birth codes. 10X, by the way, is Scottish, if you wanted to know. But again, yeah, as I said, that was a common form of employment. Amongst men, it was coal, iron, and steel working, and again, it would have been the big draw right across the industrial heartlands in the Midlands and the north of England. And let's have a look at a couple of returns from here. This is George Boyd, who's 51. He's married. He's born in Ballynahinch in County Down. He's a coal miner, stone man, and he's living in Ashington in Northumberland. You'll notice that on strike is crossed out with the name of the colliery, Ashington. That was the whole point about the delay of the census. Because on the return, if you were on strike, you still had to put in your employer or your previous employer. If you were out of work, you still had to put in your previous employer. It's all quite useful because you're trying to work out what the community around an individual was. Anyway, that's one return. Here's another return from them. This is James Downey, and he's living in 43 D Street in Jarrow in Durham. He's 31. He's born in Limerick with his wife Mary and their 3 children from a former marriage. You'll notice in there, under the marriage or orphanage column, you'll see Father Dead written by the children's names. Anyway, he's also there. James is there with his brother John. James is a blast furnace worker and he's out of work, and his brother is a shipyard worker and he's out of work. Common problem at the time. Huge number of people are unemployed. Of course, unfortunately, the Irish made up a disproportionate number of prisoners. 6% of the prison population were Irish, compared to much less than 1% who were English or Welsh. So it probably says much about the lived reality for Irish people. But also, the Irish who are recorded here, it really gets confusing. And I thought I'd give you an example. You're asked two questions: where you were born and your nationality. Remember that? They're two separate things. And I've looked at the where you were born bit, but also your nationality. Here it's really interesting. I was giving a talk to a group in New Zealand recently, and I was looking at Australians and New Zealanders. And so I decided out of curiosity to look at Australian-born and New Zealand-born who call themselves Irish. And of course, they're not the only group. There's plenty of Americans who call themselves Irish. There's plenty of others who record their nationality as Irish, irrespective of where they were born, which is kind of intriguing. Here's an example. This is not what you would normally consider to be the first example, but we have a family of retired Captain Caneston Forster Walter Lyons Montgomery. Now, he's born in Dublin in 1859, so no question that he's Irish, but he states his nationality as Irish, and this is not a time where you choose your nationality without thought, given the War of Independence, okay? His wife, Marion, is born in South Africa, but there are 5 children, all of whom were born in New Zealand, Auckland, Cambridge, Christchurch, but they all call their nationality Irish. Isn't that curious? That sense of I should remind us again how important national identity is. As I was looking at this, I found a number of other Australians who call themselves Irish as well. But the one at the very bottom I found particularly curious, and I spent some time tracking her down. Her name is Catherine Newman, and she's an inmate. Do you see that? She's 53, and she's married. And she was born in Fremantle in Australia. She calls herself Irish, and she's a laundress in an institution. Now, I was fascinated by who this might be. So I had a look at the entire return. She's on page 12 of the return. It's a massive return. It's an institution with hundreds of people in it. If you can't see her, by the way, she's there. All of these ladies, and they're all women, are listed here with their ages, and their ages cover everything from 18 up to about 60. They're all laundresses, all at this institution. And what is the institution? Because it looked pretty suspicious to me. I bet you it does to you too. No surprise. It's the Good Shepherd Sisters. But it's inmates because it's a Magdalen asylum. It's a Magdalen laundry. And this is in Hammersmith. And it had been set up in 1841 for quote unquote fallen women. And it had a total of 186 women laundresses and needleworkers there, with 28 nuns of all ages. It just reminded me that this problem was not restricted to this island. And for those of you who need reminding, it is a pretty stiff existence to live in this world. Anyway, I'm diverging a little bit from here, but it was curious. But looking at other nationalities, to put the Irish in the English and Welsh census into context, these are all the other nationalities, the major nationalities recorded in the English and Welsh census. And the Irish are right at the top. 28.6% of all those not born in England and Wales are from Ireland. Then followed by Scotland, 26%. I suppose it shouldn't be surprising, really, given the fact that the Irish and the Scots had all been migrating to England and Wales for generations at that point. Then we're followed by the British subjects born in foreign countries. Now, these are all over the British Empire. You don't know whether they're necessarily, their parents are probably born in England, maybe not. But this is part of this huge group of people right across the empire, which are the administrators of the whole system. Then you have another 74,000 who are born in the Indian Empire, which of course would have included all of South Asia, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, and so on today. Russia, the next biggest. Now that might be surprising to some of you, but there was a huge migration out of Russia, obviously following the 1917 two risings, and there was quite a lot that decided to settle in England. But I think there'd always been a fairly heavy migration at that point from Russia, going back at least 100 years prior to this date, even right up to more recent times when it's higher numbers again. Then Canada and Newfoundland. Newfoundland was still an independent dominion. Poland, Australia, South Africa, France, the USA, Italy, Germany, West Indies, and then there's New Zealand, about 7,000 people thereafter. So, the Irish are by far the biggest group of non-native born people in the English and Welsh census of 1921. Now, I want to diverge from this for a little bit because I want to do two things now. I want to actually talk to you about the project itself that Find My Past got involved in, because it was a huge undertaking for us. And I want to crow about it just a little bit. Don't worry, too long. And then I want to talk about some tricks for doing research intelligently and not having to spend too much money. Anyway, How did we do it, and why did it happen? Well, basically speaking, the National Archives back in 2018 put out a tender, a request for tender, to see who could come in to help them convert the 1921 census, which had never even been conserved. It was still sitting in the boxes and crates that it was left in by the Central Census Office back in about 1923. And they wanted to find out who was going to unpack everything and scan it, transcribe it, and so on. And we won that tender against fairly stiff competition. You can probably imagine who we were in competition with. It took us 2.5 years to conserve, digitize, and transcribe. And you've got to remember, this happened in the face of a global pandemic. I mean, they may have had a pandemic in 1921, but, you know, we had a sort of a companion pandemic to try and produce it. We had a deadline of releasing by January 2022, and we still did it. This was a major achievement. To give you an idea of how tight that was, some of the transcription work didn't even get completed until days before we actually finished. And we were still in cleanup mode for the following 3 months. The scale of the task, and I'm trying to put it in perspective, there were over 28,000 volumes with between 300 and 600 household schedules in each one, 1.6 kilometers of shelving, 3,000 miles, 4.6 thousand kilometers of returns. And it took over 7,000 combined working days to digitally image the material. You can see some of the other stats there. It was pretty extraordinary what took place. The GDPR restrictions, people probably are aware of what this was all about. Under GDPR and under data protection rules, you cannot release any information about somebody until it's past 100 years, or you can prove that they're dead. So we had to actually ensure that everything was transcribed in 3 batches so that nobody ever saw a full return. None of our keying staff, of which there were hundreds, saw any full return. They're hugely complicated. So we could actually fit within that 100-year rule. And then we had to pull it all, we had to tie it all together. We really started tying it together in October before we released in January. So it was quite something. So, and then we had 50 days to clean up before we released. So the whole thing was a crazy thing. But we did it. A big question I get asked a lot is, why does it cost so much? Because you probably know the 1921 census isn't part of the normal subscription. You have to pay extra for it. And people sit there going, oh my gosh, £500 is just gouging us. Well, that's not the case, and I'll tell you why. First of all, the National Archives set the rules by which we released it. And they themselves wanted to maximize what they could earn from this. And they're not just doing it for monetary reasons. Well, they are doing it for monetary reasons, but they're not doing it for profit. Obviously, they're a public institution, but they're doing it because they have a very ambitious program called the Archives for Everyone strategy. I don't know if you know it. You probably don't. I didn't. And it's really extraordinary what they're intending to do. But this is a cornerstone in the way they can actually raise funds for it. So they required that we actually put this out on a pay-per-view basis, because they actually make the majority of the income from this. And that's why it costs $250 to look at a transcription, or $350 to look at an image. You also get a discount if you have a 12-month pro subscription, which I'll tell you a little bit about later. But there's ways to try and minimize the cost dimension there. So I want to have a quick look about what you'll find in the census, and then how we can make it easier, because I don't want to hold on to you for too long. I've run through some of this already, so I could skip over it quickly. And again, if you've got any questions, fire them out at the end. You know about the name relationship on census questions. You know about the relationship to head of household. It's nothing different about what other censuses. I've mentioned the fact that age is now in years and months, and that we have the orphanhood question to children. Is your mother dead? Is your father dead? Are they both dead? And so on. Are you widowed? Are you divorced? Very important. First time they ever asked that question, are you divorced? And then, of course, your birthplace and nationality. We've dealt with that already, I think. Your personal occupation, I've dealt with that. The employment, who you work for now, who you last worked for if you were on strike or out of work, and your place of work, another equally important. These census questions were quite unusual, and I mentioned before how Mr. Vivian, who is the Registrar General, insisted that women actually get properly transcribed in the work that they did as home duties. There's also a lot of tightening throughout the census in terms of occupation. It's not just a generic. There's very specific requirements in occupation, so you get a much better view of what people did for a living. So there's less casual answers to this census than anyone you've seen before. There's also the dependency column, which I didn't mention before, because but right on the right-hand side of the form, you're asked how many children, what age are the children, and it was only for kids under the age of 16. So it's actually quite, you get the dependency details, and they would add them in as X's for each individual age category. You can see them up here being recorded. There's also the front of the form, which we only looked at the back of the form, had the full name and address. The address details were all on the front of the form. So that's more of those dependency details. They also dropped some questions in the 1911 census, if you're familiar with that, for England, Wales, and Ireland. They had a very similar set of questions around fertility. You may remember that wonderful question, how many children have you had? How many are still alive? We've all seen it in the 1911 census for Ireland. England and Wales had that too. They drop it. One of the reasons why I really like it is because an awful lot of men filled it in too, which sort of proves it, which was pretty useful too. The infirmity question was also removed. I'm not quite sure why. I think it possibly was because it was so heavily used in 1911 by women, declaring their annoyance by not having the right to vote. So maybe they didn't want to be using, giving any extra space for people to actually give out. As I've shown you before, lots of people gave out anyway about things. The big thing about the form is, like every other census, it's on a single form. It's all squashed in on one page. So it can make it quite confusing and quite difficult. So I'm hoping I've actually tried to make it clearer for you, and you're not so surprised. You've got your names, you've got your the place of birth, you've got the occupation details, you've got the place of work, and so on. And you've got all those other details. And then you've also got the dependents on the right-hand side. So the employment codes, I mentioned them before, all those green codes you'll see everywhere, they can probably drive you twisted trying to understand what they are. They're over here. You see these little codes in green? Handily for you, we actually have the employment codes all in a simply to use system on our site. You can actually go and find out what they are. If you can't read it, for example, you can take a code, go check it up on our site and find exactly what it is. Because as I said, they look for very specific details. You can see there's a 564/6 there. It's not just a builder, it's a particular type of builder. Mind you, it's not written down there what type of builder it is. So maybe that specific code will tell you exactly what they did. Follow it up, is what I'm trying to say. So those codes all appear. There's a link on all the censuses to the employment codes. Go and follow them through. They can give you details you might not have automatically seen. Also, the schedules come in different types, and that will be completely obvious. You can choose by schedule type. E is English household, Welsh, W is a Welsh household, C is a Welsh household who records the return in Welsh. There's quite a bit of stuff in Welsh. And then the larger returns, again, have multiple numbers of the same letter. A is the Channel Islands, don't forget them as well. And M is the Isle of Man, and so on. You can see all these codes. That could be a quick way of trying to find a type of person. So what tips can I give you for making your life easier? Because quite frankly, coming to our site, you can search everything for free, by the way. It's all free to search. And there are 46 different fields of which you can search on. So it's not, it's really heavily transcribed. It's very detailed. So play with it. Don't commit to spending any money unless you have to. Give you an example here. This is a search for a Ruth May Girling, right? This for argument's sake. The moment you put a name in, you start immediately at the bottom seeing the number of results you get. So you can start narrowing down or being more broad before you ever get to a result. You can also then take all those advanced search options, places of birth and so on. You can choose them, select them, get really precise. And then when you do get your research results, you'll be presented with two buttons here. You can get a transcript or an image for every return. But I would recommend that you actually hover over each of those items, these 4 listed items, because when you do, this example here, the first one, you'll notice that this tells you more just in hovering over it. It tells you some other names. It's not just Ruth, but it's also Emma and Samuel, and 2 others are on this record. So you're automatically finding out who other names are on this record to make sure you're getting the right return. We're trying to make it as easy as possible to get the right return for you. Also, I'd strongly recommend that if you're going to choose one of these 2 options, go for the image, because that's where the bulk of the information is. And when you choose the image, there's a lot you can choose from. You've got thumbnails, for example, down here. And you'll see when you choose the thumbnails that there's a whole bunch of extra material right beside the thumbnails. And you'll see the original image, which we've seen many of before. By the way, if you hover over the image for any individual return, you'll get the full transcript too. So you're kind of defeating yourself by buying a transcript and then buying an image. You get everything with the image. But you also, with the images, these extra materials come back to it are important because you get all the information from the cover of the return. You get the maps. There's 2 maps for every single return. You also get the plans of division, which is the enumerated description of the area. Really important to look at too. Try and get a total view of what you're looking at. On top of that, we have these links here. You see learn more, search tips, and useful links. Click on those, use them, because this is all free information. And that's where you'll get full details of how the census was carried out, what's included. You'll get information like those employment codes and many other things beside that too. You'll see there and the useful links and the resources. What other tips can I give you? Well, we also have an optional wildcard you can chuck in there because everything that's we've transcribed, we've transcribed everything. You can search across all of the returns. You can also put in an asterisk as a wildcard in a search. So you can actually, play around with, even if you're not quite sure that our alternate spellings are working, you can play around with that. Also, for locations, if you're not quite sure where somebody was, choose a location you think is close to where they were. And you see that green bar there, the search radius green bar. You can increase or decrease that by however much you like. And you can have great control over the locations you're searching for. We spent a lot of time getting that search radius bar right. It's complex, but it's a unique feature to our site. Anyway, those are some tips for using the 1921 census. And before I finish up, just a couple of images to remind you of how human these things are, because of course they're filled in by the families themselves, a bit like our 1911 census, and they're wonderful. Like the image on the left is baby boy Platt, who's 2 hours old in the census. He's the youngest person in the census return. Or you'll notice this census return on the right, which has little cat's paw prints. Obviously, that shows you a little bit about the lived reality in their household. Or this return here, we have 2 returns which have been chewed by the dog. They've said that the dog did this, or little comments about the kids in one family, their occupation, getting into mischief, getting into worse mischief, emptying feeding bottles. And this is the wonderful thing, I think, about any of these, the latter census returns, which you have the household returns like we do for 1901, 1911 in Ireland, or like they do in England and Wales for 1911 and 1921, is you get that human quality of a family sitting about, recording and filling these things in. Anyway, I hope that my presentation here is explained to you what the source is, and that it will show you that it has much more than you might immediately have thought. And I'm hoping to take some questions. But before I do, can I say just a couple of last things? If you have difficulties with transcripts or otherwise, because nothing's perfect in this earth, please contact us at transcriptsupport@findmypast.com. And if you find something really cool, would you come and tell us? Because we're curious to find out too. Email discoveries@findmypast.com, or you can always email me as well. That's brian.donovan@findmypast.com. And if you want to get a subscription, bear in mind, don't forget, all members of the GSI automatically get 25% off not just 12-month pro subscriptions, but all subscriptions. And that's because we worked on a deal many years ago to publish your old journals. So please take that opportunity up. And if you have any questions, I'll stop sharing now, and you can ask me. So thank you very much.